And it looks like we do have a guest here. Kafei, I'm guessing you're the one that posed to the question of how do we know that we die when we die?
Well, I mean that was a question you asked in the show. I thought the implication was, how do you know that consciousness ceases when at the moment of death? Was the question.
Okay, well then, Chris, let me paraphrase the question. And first of all, so that we don't have to make assumptions, he's got a neuroscientist's definition of consciousness. What is yours?
I agree with the neuroscientific definition. Only I guess the underpinnings that I know there's a lot of evidence within I guess the collection of neuroscientists, the common agreement that that materialist assumption that the brain is responsible for generating consciousness. And that's what I would probably fundamentally disagree with. In order to say such a question, like, does consciousness truly blink out when we die? And I think that's maybe where the contention leads. But nevertheless, everything else, when it comes to neurocorrelates and things like that, I'm pretty on board with most of it.
Well, I mean, the thing is, like, we can alter brain states and see alterations in consciousness, right? We can of course do it experimentally, but it happens naturally every single day. When you fall asleep, you are unconscious, and that is directly correlated to changes in brain areas is responsible for the things that we usually associate with consciousness, such as executive thinking, logic, awareness, perception. These things are well rooted in neural circuits. And then, of course, if you go in and alter them, or say, like, permanently alter them by damaging them, there are going to be permanent changes to the details of what we would consider to be conscious activity to that individual.
Well,
so already that that's the experiment, essentially. And so if you kill someone, or if, like, someone dies, right? We're not going to kill anyone. So if someone dies by natural causes, we obviously have a medical definition of consciousness. It's going to be a series of things related to behavior, their reasonable processing, whether they're delusional or not. Are they sleepy, lethargic, those kinds of things? There's a list. Like, medical professionals use this list, and we use that as a gauge to say, well, what degree of consciousness does this person have? Anyone that comes in with some sort of altered behavior where we're concerned about them, you can go through that list and see, well, what degree of consciousness do they have? And of course, down at the bottom is if they still have a heartbeat and a pulse, but they're expressing no features of consciousness, we would say that they're in a coma, or that perhaps they have experienced brain death, right?
No, I absolutely agree with that. I guess the argument where I come from is, so you have the example of Phineas Gage. I'm sure you're familiar.
Sure. Yeah.
Comes up a lot.
Yeah, I mean, just for the audience, so Phineas Gage, one of the most famous neurological cases in neuroscience. We learn about it first year in graduate school. He was a worker on a rail line, I believe, and they were using dynamite to clear out a space. And part of getting the dynamite down into these holes so they can break away the rock, they have to use a tamping rod to push the dynamite down. And as they did it, there must have been some sort of spark or something, and the rod shot out and went through his head. And yes, it's a pretty good example, because what happened for him before the accident, he was considered to be a very affable, very kind person, had a certain kind of personality. After the accident, his personality was radically changed, and it had struck areas of his prefrontal and frontal cortex. It blasted apart, I believe, the orbital prefrontal cortex, which we know is associated with. What was that?
I mean, be fair. Yeah. People do change their behavior when they have a headache.
That's sure true, which is also rooted in physicality. And kind of like the funny thing about Phineas Gage, and I think one of the arguments one could make is that, well, if you had a rod slammed through your head, don't you think you would also be a little upset? But mostly he was okay, right? Like, he didn't suffer too much physically. Like, he wasn't utterly physically deformed, even though he had this rod go through his head. But it went up through here and then out the top. He did lose a bunch of brain matter, and there were changes to his personality after that. Now, there's been a lot of debate to the degree to which, like, all of that was thoroughly documented. But we have lots of other just clinical examples of people who have suffered various aspects of brain damage where they clearly have some changes in their overall personality or changes in aspects of consciousness, right? To the point where like they aren't really expressing full consciousness. Now, I don't have a paper for you. All right. You wanted citation that when you die, the consciousness ceases. I did a little looking. I didn't spend that much time, but I did a little looking. I wasn't going to be able to find something like that. But a great book that I think is fantastic on just understanding consciousness and understanding that it is rooted in physicality and isn't dependent upon magic is The Hidden Spring by Mark Solms. He is a neurologist and a neuropsychologist. He's from South Africa. This book is just fantastic. It's called The Hidden Spring. I fully, I mean, he's a neuroscientist, so of course, like it's kind of written in my language, but I feel like it's written in a way that anyone who is interested in the topic could really understand it. And he's from personal experience and work that he has done. He really expanded my understanding of like the way the human brain works, which is not something I work on. I don't work on human brains. I know a fair amount about human brains because of course you have to, because that's the context that we put this all in. I learned an awful lot about human consciousness and the neural correlates of human consciousness from him. And I like his definition of consciousness, that it actually, so there are individuals who are completely decerebrate, meaning they don't have a cerebral cortex. People could be born without a cerebral cortex. And you would think like, well, without a cerebral cortex, how can you even exist? But it turns out, yes, those people suffer enormously behaviorally. They cannot do the things that we're doing right now, like talking to each other and able to form like full sentences or whatever. But they do express some aspects on that list of consciousness, but they don't even have a cortex. That indicates that it isn't just the cortex that is critical for conscious features. And he makes a very good argument that things like the periaqueductal gray and the Raphe nuclei of the brainstem are critical aspects of consciousness. And these are things that you're going to find in all vertebrates to some degree. And these are the things that are really important for controlling mood and affect, how we are feeling and the emotions that we're expressing. And of course, those are the things that are also affected when we take, say, mind-altering substances that alters our state of consciousness. It's all rooted in chemistry, and it's not, you damage those areas. And he makes a very good case that damage to those areas leads to a substantial drop in the aspects that we call consciousness.
But have you considered that when someone dies, perhaps they just go deaf and they can no longer hear you calling their name or asking them questions?
Of course, I've considered that. But okay, here's what influenced my thinking on all of that. Like you mentioned, substances. I don't know if you have any familiarity with direct experience with things like psychedelics.
Unfortunately, I don't. I mean, I actually am interested, but
and that's what really flipped the way I see these things, because I hold that view of where the neuroscientists have this consensus that this correlation between brain damage and the effect on personality and so forth that you just mentioned about Phineas Gage. Yep. And so where it flipped, I would like to kind of hash it out real quick to give you a quick analogy. I'm borrowing this from Graham Hancock. This is not original, but he did say to the flip side. So the standard model of, the materialist assumption is that consciousness is produced by the brain. And so that you have, like, let's say you have a factory that produces cars. So if you destroy the factory, the cars being produced is the stream of consciousness. And if you destroy the factory, then you destroy consciousness being produced, ergo consciousness leaks out. That's the consensus model that a lot of neuroscientists would agree with. Mm-hmm. Sure. And so the other model is more akin to a radio transceiver. So like the radio. So like if you have a radio set and you have a signal that's being transceived, then if you destroy the radio, it may affect the way the signal is interpreted. So, if you have these two views, of the effects being made on the personality look exactly identical from these two perspectives.
Right.
You know, so like
I get what you're saying, and I can appreciate the analogy. Now you can take the analogy further to say, well, why don't we look for whether we have a factory or whether we have a radio receiver? And
yes,
that's what the problem. So we see behaviors, right? We know that there are behaviors that we associate with consciousness. We can look in the brain. Do these brain areas, are they set up to generate and create the things like the stream of cars that we would refer to as consciousness? Or are they set up to receive some sort of signal from someplace in order to manifest the signal, right? That's essentially the idea. When we look at the brain, it is entirely set up to generate behavior de novo. It is a factory, absolutely 100%. So we have brain areas that are responsible for taking in sensory information. We have areas that are critical for awareness and perception. We know those in extraordinary detail. And I'm not referring to that as like a receiver receiving some sort of consciousness signal. That's just being aware of the environment. Then that information gets processed. And we know the areas that are involved in the processing and the selection of attention to focus on only certain features that are within the environment. Because if we focused on every single thing happening in the environment, it would be impossible for us to actually direct our energies towards things that are actually
to function. It would be impossible for the ego to function.
Right. And then decision making is, like certain things, like areas like MT, for instance. There's this area of the visual stream that's way up the visual stream. It is attentional in that it will become active when they're like dots moving across the screen, for instance. And say some of them are moving and some of them are moving in other directions, but a person or even a primate would need to make a decision about like, okay, I think the majority of dots are going to the right or to the left. And we know that activity in this area, MT, goes up right before the person makes a decision on like, oh, the dots are going to the right or they're going to the left. And so that is clearly, and by right before, I mean like literally hundreds of milliseconds before. So, and it's receiving all this input from these visual areas. Like and of course the visual areas, the farther lower you get into like V1, the primary visual cortex, or secondary visual cortex, I'm talking about like the very early stages of visual information coming from the eye. They're only reading out very, very simple aspects of our visual field. And then as you go up further and further, you get more and more complexity that gets built from the neural circuits and the way that that's done. And we know how many of those neural circuits are built.
Okay. I would ask this. Are you a fan at all of Sam Harris?
I think Sam Harris is fine. There are certain things that I think that he says and does that are problematic. I don't agree with him on everything, but I think that there are.
Well, that's the reason I asked.
Yes.
Because I
Yes.
wanted to see that discomfort in you.
Yeah.
Because like he is like I guess an atheist that's kind of at the edge of spirituality.
Yes, I agree.
And it kind of rubs a lot of atheists wrong that don't agree with spirituality. And so, the area that I like to focus in, and I've called, I've never had really the opportunity to speak to Aaron until this more recent episode. The last time I called in, the phone lines went down, so I didn't get to have an opportunity to speak to him. That
was so frustrating.
Yeah, I appreciate his input a lot more. He's a little bit more. For me, I don't know if you still hang around with Matt nowadays, Aaron, but he's become so kind of rigid in his the way he takes calls and like.
Auntie.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And so it's kind of hard to have a conversation with him. Whereas with Aaron, like, he'll give you the benefit of the doubt. Whereas Matt will cut you off because he wants to get directly to, if you don't answer his question the right or wrong way, then.
True. Yeah. Yeah.
And so
it's just, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that with Matt, he's got another decade on me about taking live calls.
Yes. And I think that's what it comes down to. I agree.
Yeah.
Perhaps. Gets frustrated quickly because he's like, I've heard this 20 times and I just don't have the patience for this.
Yeah. Maybe he's lost his patience over the years, perhaps.
I think so.
However, the one call that I've been trying, desperately for him to hear, is a call on mystical experience. I'm not too sure how deeply you study mystical experience within the context of neuroscience. And I'm talking about Dr. Roland Griffiths' work with, especially with the psilocybin-induced mystical experience.
Okay.
And so
I'm not very familiar with all that work. I mean, I work on brain development, so I'm working on things that are very early before we really are concerned.
But as a neuroscientist, does it intrigue you at all? Do you, at least?
Sure. Yeah. I find the issue of consciousness to be utterly fascinating. I mean, I've even worked on constructing a class that I can teach here at Virginia Tech on consciousness, on the neural correlates of consciousness.
Yes.
So, and we, I have not set up that class yet, so I don't have all of that worked out. But aspects of psilocybin and the mystical experience and altered states of consciousness would absolutely be a part of that class.
I wonder how, if you set this class up, if you actually start teaching consciousness, what are you going to do with students that fall asleep?
Man,
you're gonna have to change your consciousness right now because you are in an unconscious state. You're supposed to be conscious in the consciousness class.
Bill Hicks joked like that too. He said he was taking this course in Eastern philosophy, and the professor said, consciousness, God is consciousness, and we are all individuals. We're all consciousness trying to realize our fullest potential. And he phrased it like that, and then he said, when the guy in the back said, is that going to be on the test? Are we going to need to know this? Try to make trivialize it, and But I think where I'm getting at is like writers like or even like psychiatrists and psychologists like Stanislav Grof. Have you heard of him?
Mm-hmm. That name rings a bell. I'm not sure what they do though.
He said, within almost decades into his studies and his professional, role that he played, he didn't realize that there is absolutely no concrete, definitive evidence that consciousness is generated by the brain. We have a lot of things that seem to hint towards this, very strongly so, but he said a lot of neuroscientists, psychiatrists, psychologists do not realize that at the very core of all these peer-reviewed studies, there's no definitive evidence that this is the case.
This is the thing. I feel like it's going back, unfortunately, to the thing that I kind of started off with, is that people who operate with that sort of mindset, and there are neuroscientists that feel that way. You cited one, and there are others. And definitely within the philosophical circles around consciousness, you find this a lot. They are redefining consciousness to be smaller and smaller to exclude the things that we have now fully explained, or at least we have adequate explanation from a neuroscientist perspective. I would certainly concede there are aspects of human behavior that we have not fully worked out. There's a reason, right? The brain is really, really complex. We have not gotten there yet. We are still working on it. There's no indication that those types of behaviors are rooted in something that is not physical, though.
Well, I don't think that's the argument, though. I think that's
okay.
I don't think necessarily like Roland Griffiths is trying to say that mystical experiences are something that defy the laws of nature. He's done many lectures over this.
And David Chalmers would say that too, right? He's the philosopher, right? He argues that there must be some other force of nature that we don't
understand. Yeah.
And I don't believe that. I don't think.
Well, Sean Carroll argues the opposite. I happened to be in the room when he gave a presentation in San Diego, where he did this beautiful equation, which I put on my unapologetic science videos. There's this massive equation that shows up in the opening splash of all those. That's from Sean Carroll, and he was saying that that people would often say that we don't know that there is no supernatural, that there is no afterlife or whatever. And then he just points to the equation. He goes, yeah, we know. This is one of the ways to know that there's no way. One of the things that Chris and I had talked about on a previous conversation is how the mind cannot be separated from the body. that the mind, for a number of different reasons, cannot be put into a different body. What would happen if you could put the mind, hypothetically, if you could put the mind into the different body, it wouldn't be you anymore, because the construct of your mind in terms of physical neurons and everything, whatever muscle memory, whatever foreign languages and musical aptitudes or whatever that previous mind had, if you put your mind into that brain, you would have those aptitudes. You would, in effect, not be you anymore. You wouldn't be that other person either, maybe, but you wouldn't be the person you were.
You can't occupy the same space and time.
Right. David Chalmers' argument, the zombie argument, right, that you can't have a philosophical zombie, is exactly that. But although, except that he says that if you could reconstruct, say, you or a body and all the different parts, everything, and just make it poof into existence next to you, that entity would be empty. It would be dark inside, even though it may continue to act in a way that seems as if it's conscious. He thinks that there's something that is separate from that entity, and that just seems utterly absurd to me. First of all, it's just a philosophical argument. We can't really literally just manifest the exact copy next to us, but I totally think that that's absurd. Now, I agree with Aaron, though, that if you could do something like that, that entity would share an awful lot with you, initially especially, but eventually, pretty quickly, everything's going to diverge. So, like, if I could just duplicate myself instantaneously at this moment, the entity next to me would continue to say the words that I am saying, right? Because there is a series of language centers that we know pretty well that is driving the sentences that are coming out of my mouth, that are acting on the muscles that control my respiration and my vocal cords, allow me to create these annotations. But then all of a sudden, that entity next to me would be talking, and then I would hear that, and then all of a sudden I would stop and I would look, and then the entity would look at me, and now all the activity is starting to diverge, and now we got to have a conversation. We're going to take turns, and obviously the things that I'm doing are going to be different than whatever the entity is doing that's next to me. Well, but it would be the same thing.
Yeah, that's exactly what I meant by that. You can't occupy the same space and time. Yes. That, let's say you had our universe somehow, in the same way that an egg splits into twins, in the womb. Yep. A universe does this. Does that mean if you have an atomical copy in that other universe that it's you? No, because it's
obviously not. Yes, we have twins all the time, and they're very different. Yes, like we know that. And actually, that
before we get too philosophical, I want to get back to your initial question, which was based on this other philosopher's claim, apparently, when he says that there is no evidence. And I would probably have to look up where you wrote what you wrote about that. You said
Stanislav's graph. I can link you, man.
There is no evidence that consciousness stops when the brain dies. So I don't know what definition of evidence he's using, but the only ones that I know of, facts that are concordant with a particular position, or the fact that indicates, I think, is the simplest one. The fact that when you die, you stop answering questions.
Well, if you want to play a quick clip, I posted it in the private chat. Aaron, if you don't mind me asking, where are you broadcasting this live to? I've been trying to look for the page.
Oh, I'm not. I'm
okay, awesome. All right, this is cool. All right, this is awesome. All right, I know I like,
because sometimes I don't know if I'm going to need to edit something. As I was afraid I was going to have to edit this because it was
this is perfect, man. I really enjoy this. I'm glad to be speaking to both of you guys. If you don't mind, I didn't catch your name.
I'm Chris. Yes,
Chris. All right.
Yes. Chris Thompson,
my real name is Jimmy, but I go by Kafei in a lot of the forums. But I don't mind Jimmy, man. And I know Aaron. So I got confused in the last episode because they had two Aarons on, Aaron and Aaron, and so it became a little confusing.
I was enjoying that. It was one of the few times that I didn't have to constantly correct everybody's pronunciation.
Yeah, so I'm looking at Stanislav's graph, a little bit about him. He's apparently 93 and still alive.
He was. I mean, he focused on a lot of transpersonal psychology, and
right. And he's done a lot on psychedelics and but he's also talked a bit about near-death experiences too.
Yeah.
Like,
And, I mean, when it comes to the neuroscientists, I would probably emphasize Dr. Roland Griffiths. He unfortunately died last year in October.
How do you know?
It was, I mean, they call this explosion in neuroscience with psychedelics the psychedelic renaissance. I don't know if you've heard that term. It was in the New York Times, the most recent article. But yeah, psychedelic renaissance. If you search that term, it's a colloquial kind of like the social gadflies term for the explosion in science that's occurring right now with psychedelics. And there's psychedelic research happening all over the world between, I think there's 2 universities in New Mexico, some in California. There's one that just happened in Texas, and University of Austin. UK is doing a DMT study where they put DMT IV drip. So they intravenously administer DMT as long as you can stand it. So they can keep you there indefinitely. Pretty interesting study that's going on in the UK right now. And the reason I focus on a lot of this stuff in relative to neuroscience to go into, I guess, where this conversation is leading is that a lot of neuroscientists, when they describe this so-called mystical experience, I'm not sure if you've looked too deeply into how they define that within the context of the research, but they go by 6 criteria. And the 6 criteria were originally laid down by William James in the early 1900s in his book, The Varieties of the Religious Experience, or Varieties of Religious Experience. And they've refined that over decades of research, to the point where they got it now with the Johns Hopkins studies. And that's been the kind of the crux that laid the basis for all these, the rest of the studies to happen. And so they, maybe you've heard the term ego death.
Mm-hmm, sure.
Yeah. And so the neuroscientific, I guess, equivalent of phrasing that would be a diminishing in activity in the default mode network.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. And so, so there is this complete dissolution of your ordinary sense of self. Mm-hmm. And, so usually when people identify egoically with their consciousness, they identify with their body, and inside these experiences, Eastern philosophy might refer to it as non-dualism, that the subject-object dichotomy that you have between you and the rest of reality completely dissolves inside that experience. There is no such distinction that takes place. Mm-hmm. And that's very hard to imagine for people who've not had that phenomenon in consciousness occur.
Sure.
Yes. Like you said, you've never had psychedelics. You've never probably partaked in a, maybe you've never meditated in your life, or
no, that's not true. I have. Okay. I think that there's a fair amount of value for meditation.
Yes. But have you ever had a profound experience with meditation where you can no longer distinguish your body from the rest of reality?
Yes, I've never gotten to that point. And we know that, for instance, say Buddhist monks that get to that point of meditation where they feel as if they are removed from their body.
Yes.
Some of those monks have agreed to go into functional MRI machines.
Yes.
And they can see that the area of the brain that is the manifestation of our sensory self, like it basically the homunculus, the sensory homunculus.
Yeah.
The activity goes way, way down when they are at that state. When they say like,
the
activity in those areas goes away.
The activity in the default network goes down.
Sure.
But
not. So I would imagine that that's true too. But no, we also know that the activity within the sensory homunculus goes down.
Well, let me show you a diagram. Hold on. Let me see. Simon.
Well, I don't have a lot of experience with psychedelics. I have done transcendental meditation, and I can speak to the point when I should have been able to leave my body, when I could feel the vibrations, which is the one aspect about it that I could actually verify were real. When you talk to some transcendental people, that they will tell you about the vibrations, if they're going to be consistent at all, because not all of them are. But when they are, they would talk about these vibrations, and they're kind of unmistakable. That was the one thing that I was given, was that, how do you know when you're feeling these? Oh, you'll know. There won't be any question about it. And in the few times that did happen, and it was multiple times for me, there was no mistake. But I don't know if I'm hitting a plateau of what you're talking about with consciousness.
The non-dualism.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Non-dualism, where you have this
non-dualism,
complete dissolution between the subject-object dichotomy,
right? Where the state of consciousness is, there's no distinction between it and your body. The dualist idea that there's the mind and then the body. Of course, I don't believe in dualism. I don't think the mind is something that's separate.
Well, I mean, a dualistic in the
but you're saying non-dualism, where mind and body, all of that is dissolved anyway, and that consciousness.
No. Non-dualistic in the sense that you no longer you cannot identify as a material body.
You don't identify yourself as your body.
Because you can't make a distinction between your material body and the rest of reality.
I wish I could agree with that, but that was one of the frustrations that I had. I was so desperate to try to do this disassociative thing because I wanted to experience the supernatural. I wanted to get outside of my body and experience whatever this paranormal realm is firsthand. Because back then, everybody believed, even atheists, just randomly everybody believed that this sort of thing was possible. They all believed in telekinesis and all of that. And I was a spiritual person as a teenager, and so I wanted to try this. But when I'm trying to now disassociate my astral form from my physical form, I'm keeping my body completely still, and there was and I was not able to rise out of my body. I wasn't able to figure out how to, without moving a muscle, without moving at all, how do I float out or do whatever. And then there was a later experiment that I performed where I was not supposed to be able to do, while these vibrations were going on, I was not supposed to be able to move, but I realized that I can in fact move.
What I wanted to introduce to you guys, so by bringing up the topic of non-dualism, this place, so to speak, where, or if you will, where these practitioners, because you mentioned the studies that they study under fMRI. Perhaps you've heard of the Carmelite nuns that were studied under fMRI. It's a real famous peer-reviewed study that was done. I forget the year. And then there's also the Tibetan monks that were studied under EEG. But the point here is that this phenomenon that they describe of the complete dissolution of the subject-object dichotomy is one of the defining markers of what they call a complete mystical experience. And by complete, they go by the 6 markers. And I recall one episode of the Atheist Experience where Matt let me list them all 6. And after he hung up on me, of course, what else is new, right? He turned to Phil Session, his co-host that day. And he said, well, let's go over the 6 and let's see if you identify with any single one. And they went over the 6 and they couldn't identify with a single one. To me, that's a perfect proof that they've never had this type of phenomenon occur in themselves. Yeah. And so what I'm getting at with that is that this the breakdown, this dissolution, this all is one tends towards like if you've heard, maybe you've read Aldous Huxley and his notion of the mind at large. Mm-hmm. That we're all kind of tapping into one consciousness, but we experience it subjectively. And I suppose that would be the spiritualist interpretation, because like I said, I absolutely agree with all the neurocorrelates and all the details that a neuroscientist might find in their consensus that the brain is generated by consciousness. But I don't think we fundamentally know that point to assume that is the case. And it's because I've had my own experiences with psychedelics and had a complete mystical experience for myself that now my interpretation has tended towards this. So if you get every volunteer in the study, they will say without fail, invariably, that consciousness in this phenomenon, of course, I don't want to create a misconception here. They don't interview the volunteers while they're having this experience, like while they're the height of the trip,
Right. Talk about it afterwards. Yeah.
They can't even identify their body from the rest of reality. How are you going to have a conversation with them?
Sure.
Right.
So
they wait till this is over until they return to the baseline of consciousness. And then they try to ask them what they can recall about the experience. And of course, right when they get out of it, the first thing they say is, there's no way I can possibly put that into words. This is ineffable. But they don't stop there. The professionals involved in these studies follow them along for months. They do 14-month follow-ups, increments, where they follow and they continue to not only interview them, but they interview family members, coworkers, and so forth. And eventually, after the volunteer has time to mull it over, they invariably express that consciousness inside that phenomenon seemed to them to be indestructible, something that cannot cease to be. This is invariably expressed by all volunteers who have this experience.
So once again, Chris, how do you measure consciousness? And you hook up these electrodes or whatever. You've got a reading.
I mean, that's a way to measure brain activity. We define, again, it depends on how you define consciousness. That is usually just done through psychological evaluation. Like there's a certain number of features that we look for. There's a list of things that we evaluate, and you test the person, the degree of which they have awareness, perception, their reason, their logic. Like there are various things that we can use to test to see.
But you would agree that people who have passed out from over drinking perform very poorly on these psychological evaluations, right?
And to do very poorly. That's part of the reason why we define that as an altered state of consciousness. Or if they have completely passed out, we would say that they are unconscious because they are not registering on those scales.
But when they're dead, is there a marked difference in the reading that cannot be mistaken for any other living time?
Absolutely, yes. So certain things that we can look for. If someone is unconscious, but they are expressing signs of life, such as breathing, a heartbeat, heart rate, pulse, but they aren't expressing what we typically associate with consciousness, awareness, perception, talking, reasoning, those kinds of things. That person is just unconscious, but not dead. Dead means they no longer have pulse or heart rate and brain activity. And once someone is dead for some length of time, the brain will start to degenerate and there's no way to get it back, right? Like it does.
So in the multiple ways of measuring consciousness, obviously you can't do an evaluation on something that can't communicate or, follow your eyes with a little flashlight or whatever. I mean, it is also possible to lose the brain activity, whatever you would consider to be consciousness, even while the body is alive. You mentioned certain types of brain damage. You mentioned being in a coma, for example.
Yep, that's right. Yes.
Okay.
And so it requires a substantial amount of damage to have someone be completely unconscious or to the point where they have absolutely no conscience whatsoever. If you can get that person awake somehow, if they're in a coma, you can wake up from a coma and then again express consciousness, right? Those people, of course, still have intact brain areas. If they have substantial damage to the brain and somehow you get their eyes open, you will look for things. Can they focus on objects? Can they speak? Can they understand things? If they can't do those things, well, now the degree to which they are conscious goes way, way down. And you would say that they have brain damage or that they are
so then again,
a persistent vegetative state.
We end up with something where we don't even have a hypothesis on how, what mechanism or possibility could even exist for a consciousness to continue in a dead body.
No,
there's literally not even a possibility for that.
None whatsoever, as far as neuroscience is concerned. Behavior is a manifestation of the activity of neural networks. If neural networks cease to be active, you will not get behavior. Consciousness is utterly dependent upon behavior.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to have to close up because we've been well over our hour. I wanted to. I kept it up a little bit long because I know he wanted to be on here,
Yes.
and I appreciate that. But we can't keep going on. I feel that we're beating a dead horse.
A little. Now, Kafei, I actually would be interested in maybe having a discussion as a follow-up. If you wanted to, I have a YouTube channel. If you just look up Dr. Chris Thompson and check it out, I'd be cool with doing some kind of stream where we talk a little bit further. I won't hang up on you. I don't know what the 6 levels of mysticism are. I'm a little curious. I'll hold off and wait to have that.
I'll share your email address in PMs so that you guys can get connected.
Yeah.
And I'll go ahead and end this one. Kafei, thank you for being on. Thank you for posing the question.
Yeah, it was actually a pleasure talking to you. I was you know, I feel like there's an awful lot about this topic that you know that I don't, and I'd like to learn a little bit more.
I appreciate it. I don't hold any official credentials, but I am an autodidact of a ravenous degree. You know, I'm a very ravenous reader. I keep up with a lot of the neuroscience that comes out of this. I subscribe to a lot of stuff where if I get a new peer-reviewed paper on psychedelics pops up, you know, I'm there to read it. So
it's great.
I was an autodidact in practically everything for a long time, so respect for that. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close it up.
Good deal.
Good night.
Adios.